Hey folks, we're going to start reading Beowulf. It is, as I've already said, the first real story that was ever written in Anglo-Saxon. Um, it's a great story. It's a heroic epic. You totally will enjoy it. But I'm going to read it out loud, and I'm going to break it up and give you facts and interesting information about it to help you understand it in the way that you wouldn't get if you're just reading it as a regular, document, and try and give you some of that background and that cultural connection that makes it meaningful to its reader. So I want you to imagine this story being told to you by an old poet in a mead hall in the middle of winter. There's a storm outside. There's warriors inside and a giant trough of mead, and they're drinking out of drinking horns. And this old poet sits down in the middle of the hall and starts telling his tale. And it's got all of those literary devices and all of the themes and all of the lessons from Anglo-Saxon poetry that we've learned through the shorter poems in here. And we're going to talk about some of those today just to make those connections clear for you. But listen in, and I will read, and, that's all you got to do today is just hear Beowulf. Beowulf, translated by Burton Raphael. Prologue. Hear me. We've heard of Danish heroes, ancient kings and the glory they cut for themselves swinging mighty swords, how Scyld made slaves of soldiers from every land, crowds of captives he'd beaten into terror. He'd traveled to Denmark alone, an abandoned child, but changed his own fate, lived to be rich and much honored. He ruled lands on all sides. Wherever the sea would take them, his soldiers sailed, returned with tribute and obedience. There was a brave king, and he gave them more than his glory, conceived a son for the Danes, a new leader, allowed them by the grace of God. Pause. So this is starting out with the history of Danish kings, and it's like, hey, why are we talking about Danish kings? I thought this was an English bit. Remember that I think it was written in like the 1830s by an English poet for a Danish overlord when the Danes had conquered England, and so obviously it glorifies them. It tells the history of the Danes, but this gives you some context about where the story came from. And all of this would have been really well known. Like, you may not have heard of Scyld before, but Scyld is the foundational king of the Danes. He's like King Arthur to England. And people would have known him. Like if I mentioned George Washington in America, people are like, oh yeah, George Washington. Scyld would have been that famous to people who knew Denmark. So we're going to get a whole genealogy of kings, a list of kings here just to sort of set us up. But it's also going to tell us what a good king is like and what a bad king is like. Scyld was a sea king. He ruled from a ship. He was a raider. He was a Viking. I think we get that sense as well. And this also tells us where the wealth of Denmark comes from. Let's see. Conceived a son for the Danes, a new leader, allowed them by the grace of God. They had lived before his coming, kingless and miserable. Now the Lord of all life, ruler of glory, blessed them with a prince, Beo. Now, Beo means bear and has nothing to do with Beowulf. This guy's name was just Beo. Whose power and fame soon spread through the world. Scyld's strong son was the glory of Denmark. His father's warriors were wound round his heart with golden rings, bound to their prince by his father's treasure. So young men build the future, wisely open-handed in peace, protected in war. So warriors earn their fame, and wealth is shaped with a sword. When his time was come, the old king died, still strong, but called to the Lord's hands. His comrades carried him down to the shore, bore him as their leader had asked, their lord and companion, while words could still move on his tongue. Scyld's reign had been long. He'd ruled them well. There, in the harbor, was a ring-proud fighting ship, its timbers icy, waiting, and there they brought the beloved body of their ring-giving lord and laid him near the mast. Next to that noble corpse, I just lost my spot. Whoa. This is going to be a problem. How do we get to a new... Okay, here we go. They heaped up treasures, jeweled helmets, hooked swords, and the coats of mail armor carried from the ends of the earth. No ship had ever sailed so brightly fitted. No king set forth more deeply mourned. Forced to sit him adrift, floating as far as the tide might run, they refused to give him less from their hoards of gold than those who'd shipped him away an orphan and a beggar to cross the waves alone. High up over his head they flew his shining banner. then sadly let the water pull at the ship, watched it slowly sliding to where neither rulers, nor heroes, nor anyone can say, whose hands opened to take that motionless cargo. So this is a story of Scyld. He showed up like floating in a river, kind of like Moses, and then when he died, they put him on a ship and set him out to sail with a bunch of treasure, and he floated away. And ship burials were very common in the Viking Age. Eventually, they were burning the ships as they were sailing away, but sometimes they were buried in the ground, like the treasure at Sutton Hoo. It's pretty cool. But here we go, Chapter 1. Grendel attacks the Danes. Now, as you know, Grendel is the great enemy of this story. Maybe I didn't mention it before, maybe I did, but the name Grendel literally translates into the Destroyer, and he's a supervillain. So we're going to learn about Grendel here. Then Beowulf was king in the Danish castle, Scyld's son ruling as long as his father and as loved, a famous lord of men, and he in turn gave his people a son, the great Halfdane, a fierce fighter, who led the Danes to the end of his long life and left them 4 children, 3 princes to guide them in battle, Hergar and Hrothgar and Halga the Good, and 1 daughter, Yrse, who was given to King Onela of the Swedes and became his wife and their queen. Then Hrothgar, taking the throne, led the Danes to such glory that comrades and kinsmen swore by his sword, and young men swelled his armies, and he thought of greatness and resolved to build a hall that would hold his mighty band and reach higher toward heaven than anything that had ever been known to the sons of men. And in that hall he'd divide the spoils of their victories to old and young what they'd earned in battle, but leaving the common pastures untouched and taking no lives. The work was ordered, the timbers tied and shaped by the hosts that Hrothgar ruled. It was quickly ready, that most beautiful of dwellings, built as he'd wanted, and then he whose word was obeyed all over the earth named it Heorot. His boast come true. He commanded a banquet, opened out his treasureful hands. That towering place, gabled and huge, stood waiting for time to pass, for war to begin, for flames to leap as high as the feud that would light them, and for Heorot to burn. Damn, it's doing it again. I swear. How do we... I want to pause this. So we get the story of the building of Heorot. What's interesting is we have this list of Danish kings. There was this guy Scyld, who had a son Beowulf, who had a son named Halfdan, who means Halfdane, who had 3 sons, and the middle son, Hrothgar, ends up being king of the Danes because the oldest son, Hergar, died. And Hrothgar, he's not living up to his ancestors in some ways, and so he wanted to leave a mark. He wanted to do something of value, and what he decides to do is build the great hall that any Danish lord has ever had. And so there's a lot of interesting history about Heorot, the great hall that he builds. It's enormous. It's modeled in a lot of ways after Valhalla, that mythical hall in the sky, and I think that's interesting. The hall too, it's tiled in it's tiled in copper or tin, and these tiles are designed in like the shapes of images of the history of the Danes. It's got great benches and tall rafters, and the rafters have these beams that are made out of whale bones, and the ceiling is, or the roof is shingled, and the most important thing about this hall is the shingles are made out of shining gold, and so they shine in the sun, and anybody who's sailing around can see the roof of Heorot for miles. It's like a lighthouse, and this building is opulent. It shows the wealth and the power and the glory of the Danes, and Hrothgar built it for that purpose. And of course, whenever you do anything like this, it shows what we call hubris, right? Like this arrogance, this belief in yourself, and that usually draws enemies. And of course, that's the case with Hrothgar and Heorot. So here we go. A powerful monster living down in the darkness growled in pain, impatient as day after day music rang loud in that hall, the harp's rejoicing call and the poet's clear songs, sung of the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans, then proudly setting the sun and moon to glow across the land and light it. The corners of the earth were made lovely with trees and leaves made quick with life, with each of the nations who now move on its face. And then, as now, warriors sang of their pleasure. So Hrothgar's men lived happily in his hall till the monster stirred, that demon, that fiend, Grendel, who haunted the moors, the wild marshes, and made his home in a hell, not hell, but earth. He was spawned in that slime, conceived by a pair of those monsters born of Cain, murderous creatures banished by God, punished forever for the crime of Abel's death. The Almighty drove those demons out, and their exile was bitter. Shut away from men, they split into 1,000 forms of evil, spirits and fiends, goblins, monsters, giants, a brood forever opposing the Lord's will, and again defeated. Well, this is pretty intense. Grendel is this horrible fiend. The words that we use to describe him are fiend and demon. These are very religious words. He's connected somehow with Satan. There's this allusion here that you want to get. He's related to Cain. Cain, if you know your Bible, is the guy who murdered Abel, the very first murderer, the very first human being. He killed his brother, the very first human being to be doomed to hell, right? And so, he's connected to that lineage. It's also interesting because biblically, Cain murdered Abel, and then he was exiled. He was sent off to the land of Nod, whatever that place is, to live out the rest of his life. And so there's an exile connection here. And so Grendel represents the exile as opposed to the community of Herat. Also, if you're reading carefully, you'll see that Grendel gets really upset at Herat, and what he's upset at is the singing, the joy, the camaraderie that they have. And so, as a representative of nature, he hates a civilization. But when you read about what they're singing, the songs that they're singing are sung of the ancient beginnings of us all, the Almighty making the earth, shaping the plain. So these songs are sort of like hymns. They're sort of like songs of Genesis from the Bible. And so it seems that Grendel is upset at the singing because it represents comradeship and civilization, but also because it represents Christianity, which sets up a Christianity versus paganism sort of a feel here. Grendel's associated with sort of the pagan giants and Loki and those sorts of ideas. You also get this when it says that Grendel lived in a hell, not hell, but earth. Look at the locations where these two places are. Grendel lives in a swamp down in the darkness. He's associated with darkness. He's associated with a swamp, which is the kind of place where human beings can't live, where diseases are. And Herat's on top of a hill with a golden roof. It's very, very much heaven on earth. So you have this heaven-hell contrast as well, which I think ties into your paganism versus Christianity and your civilization versus nature. And you've got your exile here as well. I think that's pretty cool. I think also the Anglo-Saxon sensibilities here are worth noticing. The Anglo-Saxons are used to this pagan situation where, when you die, you join Valhalla and you're fighting in the final fight very physically between good and evil. And that sort of fits in here. Grendel is a demon. He's a fiend. In Christian religion, these concepts are usually sort of like mental. Satan's like fighting for your soul. He's not physically fighting you with a sword. But in Anglo-Saxon religious ideas, like, it is a very physical thing. Grendel is a manifestation of evil. He's a manifestation of sin, but he's a physical manifestation. And the way you fight him isn't by praying, it's by fighting with a sword. And I think that's a key that comes across here that's worth noting. So let's keep going. Chapter 2. Then, when darkness had dropped, Grendel went up to Herat, wondering what the warriors would do in that hall. You can hear the alliteration here. When their drinking was done. Now, by the way, what do warriors do when their drinking's done? Right, they pass out. He found them sprawled in sleep, suspecting nothing, their dreams undisturbed. The monster's thoughts were as quick as his greed or his claws. He slipped through the door, and there, in the silence, snatched up 30 men, smashed them unknowing in their beds, and ran out with their bodies, the blood dripping behind him, back to his lair, delighted with his night's slaughter. Okay, this gives you a sense of how strong Grendel is. He goes into a heavily defended mead hall where everybody's drunk and asleep, and he kills 30 people, just rips them up, leaves blood everywhere, and carries 30 people's bodies all at once back to his lair. So he's got the strength of at least 30 men. He can carry 30 well-armed, dead Danish warriors with him back to his lair. At daybreak, now note that Grendel acts at night. This is a very typical, story or scenario. At daybreak, with the sun's first light, they saw how well he had worked. And in that gray morning broke their long feast with tears and laments for the dead. Hrothgar, their lord, sat joyless in Herat. Now, Herat, I didn't tell you what that translates into, but it's kind of fun. It's heart. So on some level, maybe this is metaphorical for the human heart, but heart also is a word for a deer in the old language. And actually the standard, the flag that King Hrothgar flew over Herat was a big deer's head, a stag's head. And it represented sort of his masculinity and his family and culture and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of cool. There were probably also a ton of deer's antlers like inside Herat on display. Anyway, Hrothgar, their lord, sat joyless in Herat, a mighty prince mourning the fate of his lost friends and companions. Knowing by its tracks that some demon had torn his followers apart, he wept, fearing the beginning might not be the end. And that night Grendel came again, so set on murder that no crime could ever be enough. No savage assault quench his lust for evil. So there's some interesting things here. First off, like imagine waking up after I don't know, a giant frat party and there's like demon footprints and 30 guys are dead and their corpses have been carried away. I mean, that's sort of what it feels like to wake up. And Hrothgar is afraid that the beginning might not be the end. And the next night Grendel shows up again, right? He has a lust for evil. He enjoys evil the same way that and lusts for it. Lust is a sinful word, but it's also a word that means he gets sort of a sexual thrill or pleasure out of the evil that he does, which is disturbing. Then each warrior tried to escape him, searched for rest in different beds, as far from Herat as they could find. Seeing how Grendel hunted when they slept, distance was safety. The only survivors were those who fled him. Hate had triumphed. So we've associated Grendel with fear, and we've associated Grendel with hate. These are the two emotions that primarily stick with that character. Also, like the only warriors who survive are the ones who are scared. Warriors are supposed to be brave. Grendel is killing the brave ones, and the ones that escape are the ones that have negative attributes, and I think that's interesting. So Grendel ruled, fought with the righteous, won against many, and won. So Herat stood empty. The heart stood empty. I think that's interesting too. And stayed deserted for years. 12 winters of grief for Hrothgar, king of the Danes. Sorrow heaped at his door by hell-forged hands. Here's a kenning for you, hell-forged. Grendel's hands were forged in hell, like he stuck them down into a portal to hell, and Satan made his claws. I mean, his claws do cut through armor like it's butter. It's like armor doesn't even affect them. So, that's an intense little kenning. His misery leaped the seas. That's an interesting way to talk about it. But some of those guys who were running away apparently started telling the story of Grendel in different countries. Was told and sung in all men's ears how Grendel's hatred began. How the monster relished his savage war on the Danes, keeping the bloody feud alive, seeking no peace, offering no truce, accepting no settlement, no price in gold or land, and paying the living for one crime only with another. I think this is a civilization versus nature moment as well. You can't bargain with Grendel. There's no blood price. You can't pay off. Remember the exile theme, the idea of the blood price. You can't pay off Grendel. It's like trying to pay off a hurricane. It's coming to your city and you go out in a boat and you're like, here, take this gold. It doesn't work. He doesn't follow laws. He can't be reasoned with. He's just going to continue killing. He's outside of normal rules. Let's see. No one waited for reparation from his plundering claws. That shadow of death hunted in the darkness, stalked Hrothgar's warriors, old and young, lying in waiting, hidden in mist, invisibly following them from the edge of the marsh, always there, unseen. This is super creepy. This is a kenning, first off. Grendel's a shadow of death, but that's probably all an allusion to the Bible. Yeah, I think there's a verse, though we walk in the valley of the shadow of death. I think there's a connection there, clearly, in the author's mind that the readers are supposed to make. But Grendel's a shadow of death, and he's a night stalker. He hunts in the darkness. He doesn't care if you're old, or if you're young, or if you're male, or if you're female. He's just going to kill you. That's nature, too. Nature doesn't care who you are. That doesn't have any kind of honor. And it's always there in the mist. So like we've got the mist of the swamp and you're outside and like some reeds rustle and you look down, you're like, what is that? You don't know. There's nothing down there, but maybe there is. Maybe it's Grendel, right? So he's a stalker. If Grendel was in modern times, he'd be driving around the school parking lot in an unmarked white van. He's scary. And outside of normal rules and laws and doesn't obey civilized society at all. Let's see. So mankind's enemy, there's a Kenning to mankind's enemy that, of course, connects directly with the civilization versus nature theme. Continued his crimes, killing as often as he could, coming alone, bloodthirsty, and horrible. Though he lived in Herat when the night hit him, he never dared touch King Hrothgar's glorious throne, protected by God, God whose love Grendel could not know. So this is an interesting bit. This is divine intervention. We talked about that. King Hrothgar's throne is protected by God. God won't let Grendel touch it. So you can picture Grendel coming in, viciously killing everybody in the hall, but there's like a single beam of light coming down and lighting up King Hrothgar's throne and preventing Grendel from doing any damage to him, no matter how much he wants to. But Hrothgar's heart was bent. Also, I think it says, I know I'm sort of jumping around here, but it says protected by God, God whose love Grendel could not know. It's interesting that Grendel's associated with hate, and the thing that protects him from hate is love, and I think that's worth noting as well. But Hrothgar's heart was bent. The best and most noble of his council debated remedies, sat in secret sessions, talking of terror, and wondering what the bravest of warriors could do. And sometimes they sacrificed to the old stone gods, made heathen vows, hoping for hell's support, the devil's guidance in driving their affliction off. That was their way, and the heathen's only hope. Hell always in their hearts, knowing neither God nor his passing as he walks through our world, the Lord of heaven and earth. Their ears could not hear his praise nor know his glory. Let them beware, those who are thrust into danger, clutched at by trouble, yet carry no solace in their hearts, cannot hope to be better. Hail to those who rise up to God, drop off their dead bodies, and seek our Father's peace. Well, that's a weird end to the chapter. This is one of those moments that a lot of scholars have sort of thought of and discussed over the years. One of the things about Beowulf is it comes from this oral tradition, and it was probably told for hundreds of years before it was written down. But the guy who wrote it down was a Catholic priest, just like the guys who wrote all of those Anglo-Saxon poems that came before. That being the case, some scholars have argued that the Christianity in Beowulf is only skin deep. They call it a veneer. If you know what a veneer is, you ever buy a piece of furniture from IKEA and it looks like it's oak, but really it's particle board, and the oak is like this tiny little millimeter thick thing that they glued to the outside. That's a veneer. And so the idea is that like the bones of Beowulf, the story, are pagan, but it's got this Christianity that's attached to the outside. And this is an example. This really feels like an add-on. Could it be, for example, that, Grendel is not the child of Cain? Where is this Cain connection? It doesn't really seem to fit. It's almost like saying, hey, all of your old demons and monsters exist now, but they're all connected to the Bible through this guy Cain. Well, if Grendel's much more like a giant or a demon from Norse mythology, one of those monsters, wouldn't it make sense that he's the... That's my dog seeing a squirrel. I swear I'm going to lose my mind. We're going to get a lot of barking here in about 2 seconds. Wouldn't it make sense, though, that this monster is a son of Loki? I mean, Loki is having all kinds of giant children, Jormungand and Fenrir. Like, that makes sense. And if that's the case, who's protecting the throne of Hrothgar? Is it God? Would God be, protecting a king's throne, or would it be like Odin because he's the god of rulers? And so some of these things actually make sense if you look at them and say, hey, how was the story before when it was pagan, before it became Christian? And this is a debate that we can have. Is the story actually a Christian story, or was it originally a pagan story that was transformed? Because there's different opinions out there. But that's a little bit about God and hail to those who rise up to God, drop off their dead bodies, and seek our Father's peace. What does that have to do with the rest of the story? It really does feel like it was tacked on there by some sort of Christian writer when they were writing the story down. All right, so we've seen all three of our themes in action. We've seen some kennings, we've seen some alliteration. It's definitely an Anglo-Saxon story, but it's a different kind of Anglo-Saxon story about a hero. Well, we haven't met the hero yet, but we're setting up the villain. We're setting up the villain's superpower, strength of 30 men, hell-forged claws, associated with hate and fear. We get a sense of who Grendel is. And in the next video, we're going to meet our hero, Beowulf. So hold on, and we'll do that in just a second.